I only have $2. Please let me shower at your home, cowboy, said the dirty Apache woman. Before we dive into the story, don't forget to like the video and tell us in the comments where you're watching from.
Richard Hale had spent most of the past 10 years trying to keep his world small. Before settling on the outskirts of Red Hollow, he had worked as a ranch hand, a trail guide, and briefly as a deputy. But after a violent incident he rarely spoke about, he chose a quieter life. The steady rhythm of fence repairs, water hauling, and chopping would help him manage memories that surfaced without warning. His goal was simple: keep the land running, keep his mind ordered, and avoid situations that might pull him back into conflict. That evening, the sky carried the last traces of daylight as a cold wind moved across the open yard. Richard knelt beside the porch, gathering the final pieces of chopped wood into a neat stack. He noticed how the frost was starting to form on the ground earlier each day, a sign that winter would reach Red Hollow soon. He stood slowly, brushing sawdust from his hands, ready to go inside before the temperature dropped further. He didn't expect anyone to appear on his land. He had built his life, so people had no reason to visit. A sound cut through the stillness, soft, uneven, and close enough to draw his attention immediately. He turned toward the far boundary of the yard, instinct tightening his shoulders. Someone was approaching. A lone woman stepped into view. At first, he thought she might be injured because her steps were short and controlled, as if she feared her body might give out. As she came closer, the lamplight spilling from his cabin door revealed more details. Her hair hung in long, dark strands that had loosened from warm braids. Dust clung to her deerskin dress in uneven patches. Dried sweat marked her neck and arms. Her breathing showed strain, and her eyes scanned every corner of the yard the way someone did when they expected danger. She stopped several feet from the porch, keeping her distance to avoid startling him. Slowly, she lifted her hand and opened her palm. 2 old silver dollars rested there. "I have this," she said, her voice rough from cold and lack of water. "I only need enough water to clean myself before I keep moving." The request was simple, but the tone carried embarrassment and fear. She seemed ready for him to dismiss her without explanation. Richard kept his posture steady. His time as a deputy had left him cautious around strangers, and years of living alone had made his reactions slow and measured. He studied her face, noting the tension in her jaw and the way she tried to hide how badly she was shaking. She didn't look like someone planning trouble. She looked like someone trying to stay upright. "What's your name?" he asked. "Taya," she said. Her voice softened, but her shoulders stayed rigid. Richard considered the situation. Allowing a stranger into his cabin went against the rules he'd created for himself after leaving town life behind. But he also saw that turning her away would likely force her back into the freezing woods with no chance to regain her strength. Her condition wasn't something a person faked. He stepped back from the door and held it open. "You can come inside," he said. Taya didn't move at first. Her eyes flicked from the door to his face, waiting for some sign he was testing her. When she realized he meant it, she tightened her grip on the coins and took several slow steps forward, her movements careful, almost rehearsed. Inside, the warmth of the cabin created a noticeable change in her breathing. The stove glowed with steady heat, giving the room a dim, yellow-orange light. Richard saw her take in the space. The single bed against the far wall, the clean table, the organized tools, the water basin with steam drifting faintly from it. Nothing decorative, nothing unnecessary, just the structure of a life maintained through discipline. She looked toward the basin as though afraid to approach without permission. Richard lifted the kettle and set on the stove to warm further. "Use the water," he said. "There's enough." Taya nodded once and stepped to the basin. Her hands hovered over the surface before she dipped them in, releasing a tense breath when the warmth reached her skin. She washed with slow, control motions. Richard caught himself noticing the bruise along her forearm and the cut near her collarbone that looked older than the dirt around it. She kept those injuries hidden beneath her hair and clothing, but he had learned long ago how to read signs of hardship even when someone tried to downplay them. Her expression remained focused as she cleaned her face and neck, not once turning her back on the door. That detail told him she had traveled through dangerous places and had no reason to trust her surroundings. Richard took a seat in the lone chair, keeping a respectful distance. His thoughts moved through practical concerns, whether someone was following her, whether she might be in trouble that would reach his property, whether allowing her inside would change the quiet routines he depended on. But the sight of her shaking hands and the dirt peeling away from her skin made those concerns feel secondary for the moment. When she finished, she wrung out the cloth and placed it neatly beside the basin, as if trying to prove she wasn't taking advantage of his help. "Thank you," she said quietly. She still hadn't put the coins away. "You hungry?" Richard asked. Her eyes flicked toward the small pot on the stove. "If there's food you don't need, I made enough." He set a tin bowl of stew on the table. She approached with caution, her eyes lowering in a practiced habit of not drawing attention. She ate slowly, pausing between each bite as if unsure if she should finish the bowl. When the meal ended, she placed the silver dollars on the table again. "For the water," she said. "I'm not taking your money." Her fingers curled around the edge of the table, absorbing his answer. Relief and confusion appeared together in her expression. Richard placed an extra blanket near the stove. "You can sleep there. The floor stays warm at night." Taya lowered herself onto the blanket with deliberate movements, her posture still guarded. She kept her knees close and rested her hands in her lap. Richard dimmed the lamp, leaving only the stove's glow. As he prepared for bed, he noticed she was watching him, not out of suspicion, but because she needed to know what he would do next in a place that was suddenly no longer predictable. His voice stayed low. "You're safe here tonight." Taya nodded once, but her eyes remained open long after she lay down. Richard listened to the steady sound of her breathing settle into the cabin. The presence of another person in his home unsettled the routines he clung to, but he also felt something unfamiliar, an awareness of someone who needed rest more than explanations. For the first time in months, the quiet inside the cabin felt different. Not crowded, just changed. The first light of morning reached the cabin through a thin line at the base of the door, stretching slowly across the wooden floorboards. Richard Hale woke before the sun cleared the ridge, the same way he did every day, but today the cabin felt different. The faint sound of another person shifting under a blanket pulled him into full awareness. He turned his head just enough to see Taya sitting upright near the stove, hands clasped, eyes fixed on the small square window, as if she had been awake for hours. She remained completely still except for the slight tremor in her fingers. She noticed his movement and straightened her posture, bracing herself for his reaction. "You sleep at all?" Richard asked, his voice low from disuse. "A little," she answered. Her tone carried caution, not rudeness. "I didn't want to cause trouble." Richard swung his legs over the side of the bed and reached for his boots. He saw her watching how he moved, not with fear, but with the sensitivity of someone used to gauging danger quickly. He wasn't offended. He understood that kind of vigilance. He had lived it himself after his years as a deputy ended in a blood-stained alley he rarely thought about voluntarily. He tied the laces with slow precision. "You didn't cause anything," he said. Taya lowered her gaze, unsure how to take his assurance. Richard stepped outside to collect water from the barrel. The air bit sharply at his skin, and frost clung to the edges of the porch. When he lifted the bucket, he paused, listening. He had learned to trust tiny shifts in the environment. Nothing seemed off. No tracks near the fence. No signs of riders. Just the ground beginning to stiffen under the cold. When he returned inside, Taya had quietly folded the blanket she slept on and placed it neatly against the wall. She stood beside the table, not touching anything, waiting for direction as though she feared misstepping. "You can stay in where it's warm," Richard said. "No need to stand there like you're expecting orders." Her eyebrows drew together slightly. "I didn't want to intrude." He filled the basin with fresh water and set the kettle back on the stove. As he worked, he noticed she kept shifting her weight, unsure what to do with her hands. He reached into a drawer and placed a small cloth on the table. "You can wash again if you want," he said. "Traveling that long takes the strength out of anyone." Taya approached slowly. "Thank you." Her voice held more steadiness than the night before, as if warmth and sleep, however little, had settled her nerves. Richard moved toward the door to check the fence line, but she spoke again before he stepped out. "I'll work for my stay," she said quietly. "I don't need charity." He paused with his hand on the latch. "I never said you did," he replied. She nodded once, accepting the answer without argument. Outside, Richard walked the perimeter of the yard. He checked each rail, each post, each hinge on the gate. Routine grounded him. It kept his mind focused and prevented memories from pushing in when he wasn't ready for them. As he worked, he kept glancing toward the cabin, noticing how Taya moved inside. Through the open doorway, he saw her wiping the basin, arranging the cloths, sweeping stray dust from the floor. She moved carefully, choosing small tasks that wouldn't alter anything important. It was clear she didn't want him to feel crowded. When he finished his inspection, he stepped back into the cabin. Taya stood near the stove, her hair pulled back with the same leather tie, though she had smoothed the strands so they no longer hung in knots. "I heated water for you," she said, gesturing slightly toward the kettle. "Seemed like the right thing." "You don't need to guess at what I want," Richard said. He removed his coat and hung it on the peg. "This isn't a camp where people bark orders." She absorbed that carefully. "I'm not used to places like this," she said. He poured himself a cup of warm water and sat at the table. "What kind of places are you used to?" Taya didn't sit. She leaned lightly against the edge of the wall, keeping distance. "Places where it's better not to draw attention," she said. "People look at me, and they decide who I am before I open my mouth." Richard studied her expression. The tiredness in her eyes was different from physical exhaustion. This was a history she didn't want to relive in detail. But he understood it. People had judged him too, especially after he resigned from his deputy post without explanation. "You're here now," he said. "That's all that matters." Taya gave a small breath that wasn't quite a sigh, more like her body testing whether it was safe to relax. She finally sat across from him, keeping her hands on her lap. "I won't stay long," she said. "I just need a few days to rest." Richard didn't argue. He didn't promise anything either. He just nodded. "You could take the time you need." The kettle began to hum softly. Outside, the wind shifted, brushing the loose shingles with a dull rattle. Taya watched the door again, the habit of someone expecting danger even in stillness. "You got people looking for you?" Richard asked carefully. She hesitated. He saw the internal struggle. Tell the truth and risk being thrown out, or stay silent and seem suspicious. "I left them behind," she said finally, choosing a middle path. But sometimes leaving doesn't end things. He accepted that without pushing for details. "Eat something," he said, standing to prepare a small plate. When he handed it to her, she took it with both hands, her fingers cold against the metal. She ate with more confidence than the night before. Richard sat again and watched her in the quiet of the cabin. Her presence unsettled the stillness he was used to, but it didn't feel wrong. It felt like something shifting into place slowly, piece by piece. When she finished eating, she placed the plate down carefully. "Thank you," she said, looking directly at him for the first time that morning. Her eyes held sincerity mixed with hesitation. "You're welcome." Outside, a faint crunch echoed in the yard, an animal crossing through the brush. Taya tensed instantly, her hand gripping the edge of the table. "It's nothing," Richard said. "Just a deer." Her shoulders lowered, but only slightly. She wasn't ready to feel safe yet, but she was no longer alone. The chill deepened as the sun rose behind the ridge, sending pale light through the tall pines. Morning in Red Hollow always started brisk, but this morning Richard noticed how much colder the air felt inside the cabin. Taya sat near the stove, rubbing her fingertips together to bring warmth back into them. She looked more alert than the day before, though her posture remained measured, as if she was still unsure how long she had permission to stay. Richard buttoned his shirt and stepped outside, the wind cutting across the yard in a sharp gust. He walked toward the barn to check his horse. The animal stomped once when it saw him, impatient for feed. Richard stroked its neck, calming it before measuring out the grain. As he worked, he kept his eyes on the tree line, scanning out of habit. He didn't expect trouble, but he had learned that danger rarely announced itself. His years as deputy had taught him to trust instincts before logic. He noticed fresh tracks near the far fence. Hoof prints, not human, and knelt to inspect them. A lone rider had passed through during the night, moving westward. The prints didn't veer toward the cabin, but the idea of someone traveling near his land made him uneasy. After another glance around, he stood and secured the gate. When he returned inside, Taya was sweeping the floor again, though there was hardly any dust. She stopped when she heard the door open, sliding the broom aside carefully, as if unsure whether she had overstepped. "You don't need to clean every corner," Richard said. "It's just a house, not a boarding lodge." "I like keeping things in order," she replied. Her voice carried a hint of pride, though she tried to keep it neutral. "It helps me think." He understood that well. "Do whatever helps," he said, removing his gloves. Taya moved near the water basin, dipping her hands briefly to test the temperature. She winced slightly at the cold, then took a cloth and wiped her face. Her movements were more relaxed today, though a hint of tension clung to her shoulders, the kind that came from expecting a sudden change. Richard prepared a simple breakfast, cornbread and a small pan of warm beans. He placed the plate on the table without ceremony. "You should eat," he said. "I will," she answered, moving to sit. They ate in quiet, but it wasn't uncomfortable silence. It had an unspoken rhythm. She focused on the food while he watched the light shift across the walls. For the first time, Taya seemed to let her shoulders settle. After a few minutes, she said, "I traveled for 4 days before reaching here." Richard didn't look up from his plate. "Why this direction?" "It was the only way I thought they wouldn't follow." He paused, spoon halfway to his mouth. "You left in a hurry?" "Yes. I didn't plan anything. I just walked." Her tone didn't carry sadness. It carried exhaustion. The kind of person felt after outrunning fear instead of facing it. Richard didn't pry. Neither of them liked explaining their past. The more people knew, the more ways they could twist it. After breakfast, he checked the corral again. Taya followed him to the doorway, remaining just inside the frame, as if stepping past it without permission felt wrong. "You can come out," he said. She hesitated before taking one step onto the porch. The sun hit her face, and she blinked at the brightness. She wrapped her arms around herself, not from cold, but from uncertainty about how she fit into this space. Richard picked up a loose rail from the fence. "This needs fixing," he said. Taya watched closely, observing how he measured each repair before acting. He noticed the attention. "You worked with tools before?" he asked. "I learned how to mend things," she said. "Mostly clothes, sometimes shelters. Good skill to have." She stepped toward him. "I can help if you want." "I won't stop you," he said. He handed her a piece of twine. She held it with confidence, tying it tight, not to secure the rail while he steadied it. Her grip was strong but careful, the mark of someone used to adapting to whatever task was needed. "You sure you traveled alone?" Richard asked as they worked. "Most of the time. Doesn't sound safe." "It wasn't," she replied calmly. She didn't elaborate, and he didn't push. By midday, they had repaired 2 fence sections. Taya wiped sweat from her forehead with the back of her hand. Despite the cold, the work had warmed her. Richard noticed the steadier rhythm in her breathing, the way she no longer glanced constantly at the woods. Inside the cabin, she poured warm water into a cup and offered it to him. "For your hands," she said. "They look tired." He accepted it, unable to hide mild surprise. No one had tended to him in years. He sat at the table, letting the heat loosen the stiffness in his fingers. Taya watched him for a moment. "You live alone because you want to?" "Mostly," he said. "Less noise, fewer problems, and fewer people to trust," she added quietly. He lifted his eyes to meet hers. "Trust isn't easy to hand out." "No," she said. "It isn't." A short silence followed, different from the night before. This one felt like 2 people taking stock of each other, deciding whether the other was someone they could rely on. Taya stood and picked up the broom again, though she didn't start sweeping. She held it loosely, almost as if it grounded her. "I don't plan to stay forever," she said. "I didn't ask for that," Richard replied. She looked at him then, really looked. "I know. That's why I feel safe here." He didn't show emotion, but the words struck him harder than anything she'd said so far. Outside, A raven called from the ridge, sharp and distant. The day continued moving forward, but something about the cabin felt steadier than the day before. Two people who had spent years avoiding others had begun to settle into a rhythm neither expected, and neither felt ready to break it. By late afternoon, the temperature fell faster than usual. A thin sheet of cold air pushed across the yard, carrying the smell of the coming night. Richard returned from splitting the last of the firewood with his shoulders tight and his hands stiff from gripping the axe handle. As he approached the cabin, he noticed the faint glow of the stove through the window and the small shadow moving inside. Taya, tending to something with deliberate care. When he stepped through the door, she straightened from the stove, holding a pot with both hands. "I heated some food," she said. It wasn't an apology or an assumption, just a statement. Richard nodded. "Smells good." He set the axe aside and placed his gloves on the shelf. His eyes adjusted to the lamplight, and he took in the state of the room. The floor was swept, the chairs positioned neatly, and the basin had been emptied and refilled. Taya had also laid out 2 plates, though she hadn't taken a seat. "You don't have to do all this," he said, brushing with chips from his coat. "I know," she replied quietly. "It keeps me steady." She moved aside, giving him room at the table. Her movements were calmer today, but there was still a tension in her posture, an alertness she couldn't shake. Richard recognized it. He carried the same habit, though he wore it differently. They ate in silence, the crackle from the stove filling the cabin with a low rhythm. Taya's gaze drifted toward the window several times, as if checking the yard despite not being able to see clearly through the fading light. After a few quiet minutes, she set her fork down. "I didn't mean to stay this long," she said. Her voice was steady, but the words seemed rehearsed. "I planned to keep moving." Richard didn't look up right away. He swallowed, wiped his mouth, and finally met her eyes. "You're not well enough to travel," he said. "You're still half frozen and hungry." "I've been worse," she replied. Her statement was honest, but the strain in her face showed she didn't want to remember how or why. Richard leaned back slightly, studying her. "You said someone might have followed you." "Yes." She lowered her eyes. "I left a place where I wasn't welcome. People there don't forgive easily." "Family?" he asked. "Not anymore." She pushed the plate aside and wrapped her arms around herself. Not for warmth, but as if protecting a memory she had no interest in explaining. Richard wasn't a man who pried. During his years as a deputy, people told him things they wished they hadn't, and silence became one of his most trustworthy tools. But the uncertainty around Taya wasn't something he could ignore completely, not when she was sleeping under his roof. "You think they come this far?" he asked. "I don't know," she said. "I've never tested how far anger travels." The way she said it made something tighten in his chest. She wasn't exaggerating. He shifted forward, placing his hands on the table. "If anyone shows up here meaning you harm, they'll have to go through me first." Taya lifted her head quickly, her eyes widening with disbelief rather than relief. "You don't even know me," she said. Her voice didn't challenge him. It questioned her own worth. "I know danger when I see it," he said. "And right now, that danger isn't you." Her breath left her slowly, as if the tension inside her loosened just enough to let something else in. She looked away, but the line of her shoulders no longer held the same rigidity. Richard stood and added a few pieces of wood to the fire. The flames brightened, sending warm light across the room. "You planning to find work in another town?" he asked. "I don't know what I'm planning," she admitted. "I walked until my legs hurt too much to keep going. I didn't think past that." He nodded, understanding more than he let on. Sometimes stopping in the right place matters more than having a plan. Taya absorbed that slowly, the meaning settling deeper than the words. She stepped toward the basin to wash her hands, and Richard noticed a bruise along her upper arm. It wasn't new, but it hadn't healed properly. "What happened there?" he asked. She pulled her sleeve down instinctively. It was nothing. He didn't push. He simply watched her with the quiet patience of someone who had learned that truth surfaced only when a person felt safe enough to speak. When she returned to the table, she took a small breath. "I left because people wanted to decide things for me," she said. "I didn't want their choices. I wanted my own." Her voice wasn't shaky, just tired from carrying that weight alone. Richard folded his arms. "You have choices here." "Do I?" she asked. "You do as long as you want them." She studied him for a long moment, trying to understand whether he meant it fully. The lamp reflected in her dark eyes, showing a rare hint of trust forming beneath the exhaustion. Outside, the wind shifted directions, rattling the loose hinge on the barn door. Taya flinched at the sound, her body reacting faster than her mind. Richard stood from the table. "I'll check it." She stepped aside, giving him room to pass. When he opened the door, the icy air rushed in, brushing her face and making her wrap her arms tighter. She watched him through the doorway as he crossed the yard, his silhouette moving steadily in the dim light. For the first time since she arrived, she realized he wasn't simply offering shelter. He was offering safety without asking anything in return. When he came back inside, brushing frost from his coat, she met his eyes with a steadiness she hadn't shown before. "Thank you," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. He nodded. "You're welcome." It was the smallest moment between them so far, quiet, brief, and simple, yet it carried more weight than anything they had said that day. And for the first time, Taya didn't feel like she was preparing to leave. Morning came in quietly, without the usual wind sweeping across the valley. A thin fog clung to the ground, dimming the shapes of the corral and barn. Richard stepped outside with his coat half-buttoned, the cold settling over him like a weight he'd grown used to carrying. The world felt muted in the gray light, and for a moment he simply listened, something he did whenever his instincts told him change was coming. Inside the cabin, Taya was already moving. He heard the soft scrape of the broom as she swept near the bed, though the floor was nearly spotless. When he returned, she set the broom aside, straightened her dress, and waited to see what he would say. She had learned that every day in this place started with decisions she was not sure she had the right to influence. "You didn't need to start chores this early," Richard said, hanging his coat. "I'm used to working before sunrise," she replied. Her voice carried no apology. He noticed her hair had been carefully rebraided, though the strands weren't perfectly even. Something about that small detail made her look less like the weary traveler who'd arrived days ago and more like someone finding a rhythm again. Richard poured water into a cup and handed it to her. "Drink something warm before you step outside." Taya accepted it with both hands, letting the rising steam soften her cold fingers. After they finished a modest breakfast, he gathered tools for the day: an old hammer, a coil of wire, and a bucket containing nails sorted by size. "I need to mend the south fence," he said. "I can help," she offered. He paused long enough to confirm she meant it. Her expression didn't shift. She didn't look away or hesitate. She simply waited. "All right," he said. "If you want to." They walked together across the yard. The fog was beginning to lift, revealing patches of pale grass and frost-covered weeds. Taya kept her gaze moving, taking in the land more openly than she had before. She wasn't relaxed, not fully, but she no longer watched the tree line with constant dread. At the broken fence rail, Richard showed her how the wire had loosened from a post. "Hold it steady," he said, handing her one end. "I'll fasten it." She gripped the wood tightly, bracing her weight against it. Her strength surprised him. She held the rail without wavering while he drove the nail in with clean, firm strikes. When they finished the repair, Taya stepped back and wiped her palms on her dress. "You've done this a long time," she said. "Most of my life," he replied. Her eyes lingered on the corral, then on the cabin behind them. "You live here for a reason," she said, as though working through a thought carefully. "I needed quiet," he answered. "After things I'd rather not revisit." She didn't pry. Instead, she walked beside him toward the barn. "I understand leaving places behind," she said quietly. Inside the barn, the horse shifted in its stall, ears flicking as they approached. Taya took a step back instinctively. Richard noticed. "You all right with horses?" he asked. "I've been around them," she said, though the distance she kept suggested otherwise. "They're easier when you move slow," he explained. He reached out and stroked the animal's neck. The horse calmed, lowering its head. Taya watched with measured interest, her shoulders inching down from their usual stiffness. "Try," he said, stepping aside. Her expression flickered with unease, but she lifted her hand anyway. She moved slowly, just as he advised. When her fingers finally touched the horse's coat, she let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. "He's warm," she said softly. "Good sign he's healthy," Richard replied. It was a plain exchange, nothing dramatic, yet it showed a shift in her, trust in him, trust in the moment, trust that she wasn't in danger here. After tending the horse, they returned to the cabin. Inside, Taya removed the pot from the stove and dropped in chopped vegetables she must have prepared earlier. The smell of simmering broth filled the room. "You cook?" Richard asked. "Enough to keep from starving," she said. He sat at the table, listening to the gentle bubbling of the pot. Taya moved around the cabin with more certainty now, straightening a blanket, removing ashes from the stove, checking water levels. Each action was small, but it showed she was beginning to see the place as something she could contribute to, not just borrow. When lunch was ready, she placed a bowl in front of him. "Hope it's not too strong," she said. He tasted it, swallowing slowly. "It's good." A faint smile touched her lips, the first he'd seen that wasn't guarded or traced with anxiety. As they ate, Richard decided to address something he'd been thinking about since morning. "Last night you said someone might come looking." Her gaze tightened instantly, but she didn't retreat. "They won't stop easily," she said. "Not because they want me, because they don't want me choosing where I go." "Men?" Richard asked. She nodded. "From your tribe?" "Some. Not all." He absorbed this carefully. "They think you belong to them. They think I owe them obedience," she said. The words carried both anger and resignation. Richard didn't raise his voice or make promises. He simply nodded once, in a way that told her he understood more than he'd admit. "You're not under anyone's command here," he said. Taya looked at him directly. "Does that include you?" "Yes," he said without hesitation. "You stay because you choose to." Her throat tightened, though she tried to hide it by lowering her head. No one had ever spoken to her with such firm simplicity before. Outside, the fog had nearly cleared, revealing long shadows stretching across the yard. Taya stood and walked to the window, observing the land with new eyes, less like someone planning an escape route and more like someone evaluating a place she might remain. "Richard," she said softly, still looking outside, "if they find me, I don't want you pulled into anything." He stood, wiping his hands on a cloth. "Too late for that," he said. "You're here now." She turned to face him, searching his expression. She didn't find fear or reluctance. She found a steady resolve that startled her, not because it was loud, but because it was quiet and unwavering. The day ended with neither of them acknowledging how much had changed between sunrise and sunset, yet both felt the difference. One had begun to accept safety, the other had begun to choose responsibility. The sixth morning began clear and sharp, the kind of cold that made every sound travel farther than it should. Richard stepped onto the porch with a mug of warm water, scanning the land out of habit. Taya remained inside, folding blankets with slow, steady motions, unaware that something outside had already changed the rhythm of the day. At the far ridge, just beyond the line of frost-covered brush, movement broke the stillness. 3 riders approached in a loose formation, not hurrying, but not wandering either. They moved with intention, following a trail only they understood. Their silhouettes cut across the pale sky, broad shoulders, long coats, confident posture. Richard recognized the type immediately. Men accustomed to forcing their way through life. Men who didn't mind bringing trouble to someone else's doorstep if it served their purpose. He set the mug down, jaw tightening. His years as a deputy had taught him how to read danger long before it reached him. These men weren't drifting ranch hands. They were searching for something or someone. Inside the cabin, Taya tied her hair back with a leather strip, unaware of what Richard had seen. She looked calmer this morning, even rested. The bruise on her arm had darkened, but no longer seemed to ache. When she opened the door to step outside, she halted immediately. Richard's posture told her something was wrong. "What is it?" she asked. "Riders," he said without turning. 3 of them, coming this way. Her breath caught in her throat. Not loud, but sharp enough that he heard it. "Show me," she whispered. He stepped aside. Taya moved to the edge of the porch and looked toward the ridge. The moment she saw the riders, her face changed. Fear tightened every muscle, and her hand gripped the railing so hard her knuckles whitened. "I know them," she said. The words felt scraped from her throat. "How close are they?" Richard asked. "Close enough," she replied. He didn't question her further. She didn't need to explain. He had seen the fear of being reclaimed before. Women dragged back to places they never wanted to return, men forced into debts they didn't owe. He recognized that same dread in her eyes. Richard walked to the barn, not rushing, but with a deliberate pace that carried purpose. He wasn't preparing for violence. He had no desire to return to those days, but he was preparing to stand firm. Taya followed him halfway, then stopped. "I don't want them hurting you," she said. "They won't," he replied. She didn't believe that. She also didn't argue. Richard checked the latch on the barn door, then retrieved his coat. He didn't grab the rifle hanging near the rafters, not yet. He wanted to greet the riders without escalating the situation, but he also wanted them to know he wasn't defenseless. His calm posture said enough. By the time he stepped back outside, the riders had reached the fence line. They slowed their horses, scanning the property with the uninvited confidence of men who had already decided they had the right to be there. Richard didn't move from his spot in the yard. "Morning," one of the men called out, his voice carrying a practiced friendliness that didn't match his eyes. "Morning," Richard replied. The leading rider eased forward. He was tall, with a trimmed beard and a coat worn from heavy travel. His gaze flicked over Richard, then toward the cabin. "We're looking for someone," he said. "Came through this area a few days ago. Apache woman, traveling alone." Richard didn't shift his stance. "Haven't seen anyone," he said evenly. The man tilted his head slightly, studying him with the practiced patience of someone used to extracting information. "You live out here by yourself?" the rider asked. "That's right. No visitors?" "Not often." The man's eyes slid past Richard toward the porch. Even from a distance, he noticed the faint outline of a figure behind the curtain. Taya watching, hidden but not enough. "Mind if we look around?" the man asked. "I do mind," Richard said calmly. "This is private land." The riders exchanged glances, irritation surfacing beneath their forced civility. "We're trying to bring her back safely," the man insisted. "She doesn't want to return," Richard said. His voice sharpened, not loud, but unmistakably final. The leader straightened. "So you have seen her?" Richard didn't answer. He didn't need to. His silence said enough, and the men reacted just as he expected. Hands tightening near their holsters, eyes sharpening with threat rather than negotiation. Before the air thickened further, Richard stepped forward one deliberate pace. "No one crosses that fence," he said. "Not today." The leader stared at him, weighing the situation. He wasn't afraid, but he also wasn't reckless. He studied Richard's posture, the steady shoulders, the calm breathing, the readiness of a man who had faced far worse than 3 arrogant riders. After a long moment, the man clicked his tongue, signaling his horse to turn. "We'll be back," he said. "I'll be here," Richard replied. The 3 men rode off, leaving the quiet behind them. Richard didn't move until the last rider disappeared over the ridge. Only then did he turn toward the porch. Taya stepped outside slowly, her face drained of color. "They won't stop," she said. "They think they own whatever they set their eyes on." "Then they'll have to learn they're wrong," Richard said. She stared at him, disbelief mixing with something deeper, something that looked like trust forming against her will. "You don't owe me anything," she whispered. "I don't need to," he said. "You're here. That's enough." Taya swallowed hard, struggling to speak. "No one's ever stood between me and them." Richard stepped closer, keeping his tone steady. "You're not alone anymore." The words hit her harder than the threat of the riders. She lowered her gaze, not from fear, but because the weight of his certainty was almost too much to hold. And for the first time, she let herself believe that this place, this quiet, weathered cabin, might actually protect her. The morning after the riders came brought a different kind of quiet. It wasn't the calm Richard usually depended on. It was heavier, watchful, shaped by the knowledge that trouble had found their trail. Even the wind seemed to move slower across the yard, as if waiting for something to shift. Inside the cabin, Taya stood near the table with a length of thread between her fingers. She had begun repairing the torn seam on her dress, her concentration fixed and steady. Richard noticed her hands didn't shake the way they had before. Fear had not disappeared, but it had settled into something controlled, an alertness she had lived with for years. He filled the kettle with water, placing it on the stove. "You sleep at all?" he asked. "Some," she said. "Not enough to forget yesterday." Richard rubbed the back of his neck, feeling a familiar tension. "They didn't come back in the night," he said. "Tracks around the ridge were moving west. They might have gone to ask questions in town." Taya set her needle down. "What will you say if someone asks about me?" "What I need to," he replied. "Nothing more." She studied him, trying to understand this kind of loyalty. For most of her life, offers of help came with conditions. Richard offered nothing more than a steady presence, which confused her more than any threat. After breakfast, they stepped outside together. Frost covered the ground in thin sheets, crunching under their boots. Taya wrapped her arms around herself, bracing against the cold. "Winter's moving faster this year," Richard said. "We need more wood stacked before snow hits." "I can help," she said. "You sure?" She nodded. "Work keeps my mind quiet." They walked to the chopping stump. Richard swung the axe with clean, practiced motion, each split producing a sharp crack that echoed through the yard. Taya gathered the broken pieces and carried them to the porch, stacking them carefully along the wall. Her movements became more confident with each trip. Between loads, she glanced at the horizon. "You think they'll return?" she asked. "Men like that don't give up quick," he said. "But they'll find I don't scare easy either." Taya stopped mid-step. "You could get hurt because of me." "Could have gotten hurt plenty of other ways," he said, picking up another log. "This one at least makes sense." She didn't know what to say. Her throat tightened, and she turned away before emotion could show on her face. By midday, the woodpile had doubled. Richard wiped sweat from his forehead with the back of his wrist. "You work harder than most hands I've hired," he said. "I've had to," she answered. He paused, studying her quietly. "You ever have a place that felt yours?" "No," she said immediately. "I moved too much. Stayed nowhere long enough to claim anything." Richard nodded, understanding that more deeply than she knew. After he left the deputy's badge behind, he had drifted across the territory with the same uncertainty she carried now, searching for a place that didn't ask anything from him. Red Hollow had become that place, though loneliness came with the peace. Taya leaned against the rail, staring at the cabin. "This house is sturdy," she said. "It's held up so far." "You keep it like someone expecting company," she added. Richard smirked faintly. "I keep it like someone who doesn't want to live in a mess." She gave a small breath, not quite a laugh, but the closest she'd come since arriving. They returned inside when the cold grew harsher. Taya tended the fire, placing logs carefully, adjusting the vent until the flame steadied. Richard watched from the table, noticing how naturally she moved around the room now. Her steps were sure. Her shoulders weren't curled inward anymore. She wasn't exactly relaxed, but she no longer appeared ready to run. When she finished, she sat across from him. "I don't know what to do next," she admitted. "You don't have to know," he said. "Surviving one day at a time is enough for now." Her eyes softened, a mix of relief and uncertainty crossing her face. "Do you want me to leave once they're gone?" she asked. Richard leaned forward. "If I wanted you gone, you wouldn't be sitting at my table." Silence settled between them, but it wasn't cold or awkward. It was steady and warm, the kind that forms when people choose to remain in each other's company without demanding answers. The wind outside shifted direction, brushing against the walls. Taya glanced toward the window again, but her expression held something new, less fear, more determination. "Richard," she said quietly, "if they come back, I won't hide behind you." "I'm not asking you to," he replied, "just asking you to stay close." She nodded slowly, accepting that partnership without needing further explanation. As evening approached, they worked side by side, preparing the cabin for the night, tightening shutters, checking the latch on the door, securing the lanterns. There was no discussion about what role each of them played. They simply moved in sync, as if they'd done this for years instead of days. When the stove filled the cabin with steady warmth, Richard sat on the edge of the bed while Taya settled near the fire. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. The day had answered more questions than either had dared to ask. For the first time, the cabin didn't feel like his home alone. And for the first time, Taya looked like someone who might allow herself to belong to a place she wasn't forced into. Neither admitted it aloud, but both recognized the shift. They weren't just sharing shelter anymore. They were building the beginnings of a life, quiet, fragile, and real. The 8th day began with a thin veil of snowfall drifting across the yard, soft enough not to pile, but steady enough to warn of harsher storms ahead. Richard opened the cabin door and watched the flakes fall in slow, scattered patterns. He took a breath of the cold air, feeling the familiar pull in his chest that came whenever change hovered nearby. Today held that feeling sharply. Behind him, Taya wrapped a blanket around her shoulders. She stepped closer, careful not to disturb his thoughts. "You're watching something," she said quietly. "Snow's early," he answered. "Winter might be rougher this year." Taya stood beside him, gazing at the yard that stretched out white and silent. For the first time since arriving, she didn't watch the tree line for danger. She watched the land itself, studying it as if trying to understand whether it could hold her future. Inside, the stove hummed, filling the cabin with steady warmth. Richard sat at the table and pulled on his boots while Taya folded the blanket and set it neatly on the bed. Her movements were slower today, thoughtful, like she was wrestling with something she hadn't yet named. When Richard finished lacing his boots, she spoke. "I've been thinking," she said, hands clasped in front of her, "about what happens next." He straightened, giving her his full attention. "I don't want to run again," she continued. "Every time I leave a place, I lose a part of myself. I'm tired of losing things." Richard listened without interrupting. The steadiness in her voice told him she wasn't speaking out of fear, but from clarity she had built during the last quiet nights in the cabin. "You're welcome to stay," he said. "You really mean that?" Her tone was calm, but her eyes searched his face for cracks in the offer. "I do," he replied, settling his hands on the table. "You've been working, helping, keeping things moving. This place hasn't felt this balanced in a long time." Taya looked down at her feet as if grounding herself. "I've never chosen a home before," she said. "I wasn't allowed to. Choice is all that matters here," Richard said. "You stay because you want to, not because you're expected to." Her breathing deepened, steadying her nerves. "I want to stay," she said finally. The words left her with weight, like she'd been holding them inside for too long. Richard didn't smile. He was not a man who showed emotion easily, but something in his posture softened, a small shift that wasn't visible unless someone knew him well. "Then we'll make space for two," he said. Throughout the day, they worked around the cabin with a new purpose neither openly acknowledged. Richard reinforced the shutters with extra nails while Taya gathered belongings she had kept tucked under the bed. A small satchel, a few items she had carried across miles, a broken bead string that held more meaning to her than its condition suggested. Near noon, she approached him with the bead string in her hand. "This was given to me when I was young," she said. "It broke years ago. I've never fixed it. You want to repair it?" Richard asked. She nodded. "I want something from before to still matter." He brought her a thin thread from the drawer and placed it in her palm. "Then we'll fix it," he said simply. They sat at the table together, shoulders close but not touching. Taya threaded each bead carefully, her fingers steady despite the emotional weight behind the task. Richard watched her concentration, appreciating the quiet determination she carried. When she finished, she tied the string gently, checking the knots twice before finally exhaling. "It's whole again," she said softly. "So are you," Richard replied, without hesitation. She looked at him quickly, startled by the simple truth of his words. But she didn't look away this time. During the afternoon, Richard taught her how to use the small saw to cut clean lines through stacked wood. Taya followed his instructions, gripping the handle firmly without letting fear control her movements. "You don't doubt yourself," he observed. "I doubt everything," she said, "but I do it anyway." He respected that, more than he knew how to express. Later, while they worked on the porch, Taya paused, her breath forming a small cloud in front of her. "Richard," she said, "why did you let me stay that first night?" He answered without looking up. "Because you needed shelter, and I wasn't about to leave someone freezing outside." "But plenty of men would have," she said. "I'm not plenty of men," he replied. That answer settled something deep inside her. As the light faded, they returned to the cabin. The lamplight washed the walls in a warm hue, and the air smelled faintly of wood smoke and stew they had prepared earlier. For the first time, Taya placed her belongings on a shelf instead of keeping them hidden. It was a small act, but Richard understood its significance immediately. "You're claiming space," he said. "I think I am," she answered. They sat quietly for a while, each absorbing the shift that had taken place. Not dramatic, not loud, just real. Before turning in for the night, Taya spoke again. "If those men return, I won't leave. I'm done running." "I didn't expect you to," Richard replied. "You're stronger than they know." Her expression warmed with something new. Not fear, not guardedness, but a calm acceptance that this place and this man were worth trusting. When the stove crackled and the wind pressed softly against the cabin walls, Taya settled on her blanket near the fire. Richard lay on the bed, but neither fell asleep quickly. They listened to the same quiet, breathing the same warm air. And for the first night, neither felt alone. The snowfall thickened overnight, coating the yard in a clean, unbroken layer of white. Richard opened the door at first light, letting the cold sweep into the cabin. The morning was quiet, too quiet, but this time he didn't feel the usual tension that came with empty silence. Something in him had changed since Taya arrived. The land no longer felt like a place he was guarding alone. Behind him, Taya sat up from her blanket near the stove. Her eyes adjusted to the dim morning glow, and she pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders. "Anything out there?" she asked. "Not a thing," Richard said. "Just snow." She stood and joined him at the doorway. Together they looked across the yard, their breaths rising in small clouds. The frost clung to the fence rails, turning them silver. Richard watched Taya as she examined the land. Noticing for the first time, she didn't scan for danger. She scanned to understand where she belonged. After breakfast, Richard prepared to check the perimeter. "I'll come with you," Taya said. "You don't have to." "I want to," she replied. Her tone wasn't defensive. It was certain. They stepped outside, their boots sinking into the snow with crisp, steady crunches. The cold bit at their faces, but the air was calm, the sky a clean pale blue. Nothing moved except distant birds circling near the ridge. When they reached the south fence, Richard knelt to examine the posts. "No tracks," he said. "Not even deer." "That means they're gone," Taya said softly. Not hopeful, observant. She crouched beside him, her hand brushing the frost from a rail. "I thought they'd return. Men like that hate being told no." "They didn't want to fight," Richard replied. "And they know I won't give ground." Taya looked at him with quiet gratitude. "You stood between me and them." "I stood where I needed to," he said. They continued walking until they reached the ridge where the riders had last appeared. Richard scanned the horizon. Everything was still. A long moment passed before he realized Taya was studying him, not the landscape. "You feel safer today," she said. "So do you." She didn't deny it. They walked back to the cabin side by side. Their footprints formed two parallel lines in the snow, unmatched in size, but equal in direction. Inside, Richard removed his coat and hung it on the peg. Taya remained by the door, holding her shawl between her hands. Something weighed on her mind. "I've never had a place where I could choose to stay," she said. "I've always been moving because someone else decided it." Richard stood still, letting her words settle in the quiet. "You have a say now," he said. Taya stepped closer, her nerves visible in her posture, but her voice steady. "Then I want to stay here," she said. "With you. Not because I fear leaving, because I want a life that's mine. And this is the first place that's ever felt like it could be home." Richard drew in a slow breath. He wasn't a man who spoke quickly about feelings, but the meaning behind her words hit him harder than any physical blow he'd taken in his deputy years. "You belong here," he said. "You always have, whether you saw it or not." Her eyes softened. The tension she'd carried since the day she arrived loosened in her shoulders, replaced by something calm and certain. She looked around the cabin, the stove, the table, the single bed, the shelves, the tools lined neatly. "If I stay," she said, "we'll need more room. One bed isn't enough." Richard smirked faintly. "Then we'll build another." Taya's expression shifted, not with surprise, but with warmth. She placed a hand on the edge of the table, grounding herself before she spoke again. "I'm choosing this," she said. "I'm choosing you." Richard stepped forward, closing the distance between them. His voice dropped, low and certain. "And I'm choosing you right back." No dramatic gesture followed. No sudden embrace. Just two people standing inches apart, both allowing themselves something they had denied for years: belonging. The rest of the day unfolded with quiet purpose. They reinforced the roof before heavier snow arrived, repaired loose boards near the barn, and reorganized tools to make room for Taya's belongings. Every task was done together, the work flowing naturally between them. By evening, the cabin felt different. Warmer, lived in, shared. As Taya prepared one final pot of stew, Richard brought a small wooden box from under the bed. He set it on the table without speaking. "What is that?" she asked. "Something I kept from my mother," he said. Inside were two carved wooden figures, simple, small, but skillfully made. Richard hadn't touched them in years. She kept them to remind herself that a home was something you built, not something you waited for, he said. Taya reached out, tracing one of the carvings with her fingertip. She understood the gesture completely. "Then let's build ours," she said. Richard nodded once, moved in a way he didn't know how to express. Later that night, the two of them stood at the doorway again, watching the snow fall onto the dim sky. The wind had quieted, leaving only the soft drift of flakes settling on the ground. Taya stepped close enough that their shoulders brushed lightly. Intentional, unforced. Richard placed a hand over hers. "No more running," he said. "No more," she replied. The cabin behind them glowed with warm light. The land before them lay quiet and open, and the future they were choosing, together, felt steady, certain, and entirely theirs. Taya had found a home by her own choosing. Richard had found someone who brought life back into a place built for silence. Their story didn't end with uncertainty. It ended with belonging, and it began again with peace.